In this tutorial, we will be looking at how to use Unity's UI system specifically for developing mobile and web apps. Unity is most known for being a game engine, but it is a very powerful tool that has a lot of other uses beyond that. If you're going to be developing something for mobile or web, the first thing you'll want to do is add the modules for your desired platform from the Unity Hub. You can find that option on the Unity Hub under the Installs tab and select the version of Unity you'll be using. And with the 3-dot drop-down, select Add Modules. And here you can choose which modules you are building for. When you check the box of something you want to build for and hit Done, it will install a module that will allow you to build for that platform. If you're building for Android, one thing to be aware of is there is a drop-down underneath the Android checkmark, and you will need to check both boxes for the things underneath Android build support. So all three of those boxes should be checked for Android. If you are building for web, the one you'll want to check is WebGL build support. When you're creating a Unity project for a web or mobile app, it is possible that the entire thing you're creating will be in 2D, in which case you could select the 2D option when creating your new project. However, you may also want to have 3D things in the background behind the UI, or have 3D elements that act as UI. Either way, if you choose the 2D or 3D option, it is easy to change your settings in Unity after you start developing. So this particular decision is not particularly significant which one you choose. So in my Unity project, I'm going to start by creating a canvas. Canvas is the thing Unity uses to render its UI elements and to keep all of the UI organized and in a functional way. So you find that under Game Object, UI, Canvas. And when you create a canvas, the first thing that happens is you get a canvas game object, and you also get an event system game object. This event system game object is what makes the canvas functional and allows you to click on buttons and have those affect things in the game. So you want to make sure that you don't delete this event system. It's very important. The canvas itself is where you will put your UI elements, and if you double click on the canvas, it will zoom you out so you can see the entire canvas view. The canvas is not rendered by the same camera as the scene. So if you were to double click on the main camera, you'll see it's just this tiny little space down here, but if I double click on the canvas, it's a much larger space. Canvas is rendered in its own separate way and is not relying on the scene camera. So on my canvas, I'm going to go ahead and add some elements. But before I do that, I want to set some important settings for my canvas. The first one is UI scale mode. By default, this is set to constant pixel size, but I find it is always best to change this to scale with screen size. This will make it so that no matter how big the screen is that you are displaying your final product on, that it will scale the canvas to match that size. This is really important when you're building to mobile because it can be difficult to know how big UI elements will be when you put it on the mobile device. So having it scale with screen size means that Unity will attempt to scale up everything you put on the canvas to match the target screen size. If you created background art that you want to use on your canvas, I recommend using a reference resolution that matches that background art. Otherwise, it's not particularly significant what your reference resolution is, but it's helpful if you have started building art assets to use the same resolution that you are building those art assets. So assuming I had started building with 1920 by 1080 as my screen resolution, that's what I would want to put here. One thing that's important to note, though, is if you are building for mobile, you may not be using a standard monitor screen size. And you can test out different screen sizes on your game tab. From this drop-down here that says 16 by 9, you can change to a different aspect ratio to figure out what it would look like if you were, say, using a phone with portrait mode. None of these options that are here by default are portrait mode, so I would need to add a new option here with this plus, and I would choose 9 by 16. There are so you want to change the fixed resolution to aspect ratio and then change this to 9 by 16. So there are different aspect ratios for different phones, and if you have a specific phone in mind, I would suggest using that specific aspect ratio. However, if you're just developing for phones in general, I suggest using 9 by 16 as the default because this would fit the majority of phones. And you can see it changes my window size to about the size and shape that I would see on a phone. Since I changed my window size to 9 by 16, I would also want to change my canvas scaler. Instead of 1920 by 1080, I would want to do 1080 by 1920. You could also adjust if you want it to attempt to match the width or the height. What this does is if you are displaying on a phone that is taller or wider than your target, it will decide if it's more important for the height to look correct or if it's more important for the width to look correct. So you could also just put it halfway in between if you don't feel strongly one way or the other, and it will just sort of find a happy medium between the two. This is normally the option that I choose, but if I had something where I had specific elements, for example, if I had background art that would look really bad if it stretched side to side or stretched top to bottom, that might cause me to lean one way or the other. So let's add some UI elements. I'm going to start by adding some text, which is also under GameObject, UI, text. And I can double click on it to see where it's at. And it's very tiny and also very blurry. If I go to my game window, I can see there's the text right there. Part of the reason it's so small is because of my my scale with screen size, my reference resolution. If you set this to a lower number, you'll find that the text appears clearer and more crisp. So the reference resolution that you're using to scale your screen size does affect things like text. Now, however, my text is very large. And I will start to notice some artifacts because I've used such a small number here. So the default was, I think, 600 by 800. So if you prefer to use the default reference resolution, then you'll have a little bit easier time starting with your text. But the main thing that we want to do with the text anyway is that we want to increase the font size. So regardless of your starting reference resolution for your canvas scaling, the very first thing we want to do is increase this font size. If you start increasing it and it disappears, what happens is as you increase the font size, it becomes too large to fit in this text box that it appears in. And to adjust that, you can change the width and height of that text box. So we can make the width and height much larger. And now we can increase this font size without fear of it disappearing. The first few times you do this, it'll really be trial and error to figure out how large you want your font size to be to get it to look correct on the screen. If this is going to be my title text, I probably want it to be the largest text on the screen. And I'm going to change the text here in the text field. This is where I would put the name of my app. Now when I started typing here, you might notice that it was showing up, and then when I typed the last letter, part of it disappeared. So my width is not quite enough to hold that much text. So I can increase the width. Now I'm increasing the width and the height on the rect transform. This is not the same as scaling. If you scale text, what happens is the text becomes distorted, and that's the scale values down here. So we don't want to adjust text using the scale transform tool. We want to use the width and height options here. I generally like to give a little bit of buffer space around the edges of the text field because it is possible when it's rendered on different screens that it might end up making the text too large and part of it would disappear. So I like to have a little bit of extra space around the edges. Now you also might notice that the text is aligned to the left edge and to the top of this text window. We can change that with the paragraph alignment settings. For a title, I would normally center it both in the vertical and in the horizontal. So now you can see that it is centered in this text box. I also want this to be near the top of the screen, and I'd like it to be centered. So rather than attempting to figure out where the center is here, you can set the X position to 0 and it will be centered on the screen. Now, having it up at the top like this, I want to make sure that no matter how big the screen size is, that it always appears at the same size of the screen. If you change to free aspect ratio, you can adjust the aspect ratio by changing your window size, and you can get a sense for how the screen will change at different screen sizes. And so you can see right now that at a certain point, maybe if I was using this on a tablet rather than a regular phone, the text would start getting cut off at the top. The reason for this is because my text object is bound to the center. The center is where it's being anchored to. So I'm going to set this back to 9 by 16. And I'm going to bind this to the top center. And the way we do this is also on the rect transform, this thing that looks sort of like a crosshair. This allows you to choose where you're binding things to and also if they should stretch with the screen. So if you choose one of these with the blue arrows, it's going to attempt to stretch that object. And we definitely don't want text to stretch, but we do want to be able to bind it to the top of the screen. And you can see with the little dot where the red lines cross, that's where it's going to be bound to. So now I have it bound to the top of the screen, and you can see that with the little X arrows here. Now if I were to go back and change to free aspect ratio, now I can see that no matter what screen size I'm using, the text always appears in that top portion of the screen. So this is exactly how I want that to work. Next, let's add some buttons. This is also under Game Object, UI, and Button. So here's the button that I've just created. And I'm going to have my buttons, since this is going to be a portrait mode app, I'm going to have my buttons sort of lined up down the center of the screen. So with my button selected, I'm going to set the X position to 0, and I'm going to raise the button up a bit above the center line. Now with buttons, they automatically come in with text, and just as we did with our title text, we will want to increase that font size. But the text in a button is actually bound by the edges of the button itself. So if I increase this font size too large, eventually it will disappear. So what I want to do is I want to increase the size of my button, and we do that the same way we did with the text by adjusting the width and the height. Again, I recommend not using the scale tool because this causes your text to get stretched out, and it also stretches out the button image itself. So we'll adjust the width and height. and then we can increase the font size of the text. Now I need to decide what the text should be for my buttons. And this is going to be essentially the start screen of my app. And this is where I would do any kind of functionality that I want the user to do before they start using the app. So for example, maybe I have the kind of app where the user should log in before they begin using the app. So I could have a login button. And for organization purposes, I like to name my buttons. So I'll name this login button. And maybe I'll have a second button for some settings. Maybe these are some settings that are not based on the user who's logged in. So this would be settings button. And I'll change the text to say settings. Now, if you're making a mobile app for Android or iOS, it's important that you do not use an exit button. Both Google and Apple discourage using an exit button in apps, and Apple will actually reject apps from the App Store automatically if they include an exit button. That's because on mobile devices, the exit is supposed to be using the home button on the phone. So I have a login button and I have a settings button, and I want to add some functionality to them. So first thing that I want to do is take a look at how the button is set up to function. If you select a button and scroll down in the inspector, you'll see this button component, which is how a button gets its functionality. If I were to hit play right now, I would see that I can already click on the buttons, and you can see that there is a tint that is applied to them when I click on them. When I click on them, they are also calling this on-click function down here, and right now nothing is happening in there. I'm going to show how to do pretty much the easiest functionality with this on-click, which is also the most useful for prototyping. So I'm going to hit the plus down here. And now it gives me a spot where I can drag a game object. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make something called a panel. So under game object UI, I'll select panel. And the panel, this is going to be something that pops up when the user clicks on one of the buttons. And by default, it is set to stretch across the whole screen. Rather than having it stretch across the screen, you can give it some buffer space. So let's do 40 for the edges, left and right. I'm just typing whole numbers here to give some buffer space. And then top and bottom, let's do 200. So this will be my pop-up. And by default, it is semi-transparent. I'm going to go ahead and make this a solid color. Maybe change the color up a bit. You can also give it an outline. Outlines are also really useful for text as well, and you can add outline to any UI element by adding the outline component, and you can adjust the size. So in my game view, I can see there is an outline around this object now. I can toggle the outline on and off so I can see what that looks like. Could even make it a bit thicker. All right, so now I have an outline going around this. Now you might notice that my default screen has a background color. That is being set by the camera's background color. So if I wanted to change that background color, I would do that from the camera. So I just have the camera selected and I'm choosing background here. If instead of using a background color, if you wanted to have a background image, we would do that with an image UI element under game object UI image. And I have a background image here that I'm going to use. So if you have an image you want to use, you just drag it onto the source image slot. So I have my image selected in my scene, and I drag this image onto the source image slot. And then I would hit set native size, which stretches the image as large as it was made to be. And what I might want to do, since this image is much wider than a phone screen, I might want to redo my background image so that it would actually make sense for this size of a screen. But I could also just choose which part of this I want to be on the screen. I could also adjust the width and the height if I wanted to. If I'm dragging the width and the height, you can see I'm just clicking on the word width and dragging it here. What's happening is it's adjusting the actual resolution of the image, so it's being stretched or squished. So I'm going to go back to set native size. And if I use preserve aspect ratio, now when I adjust the width, it is actually adjusting the image as a whole so that it is not being stretched or squished. So that's how I would recommend making those adjustments. So I just checked the preserve aspect ratio box after hitting set native size. And you can adjust where you want it to be positioned. Now you might notice that this image is now in front of everything else that I've put on the screen so far. That's because things in the canvas are rendered in order by their order on the canvas. So if I want this to be the background, I would just drag this to the top. It still needs to be on the canvas as a child of the canvas object, but if it's at the top, it will be rendered behind everything else. Now that I have a background image, I would probably want to add an outline component to my text to make it a little bit more visible on the background. I find it helpful to either have a light outline around dark text or a dark outline around light text. So I might do a black outline and change my text color. I could use the color tool to pick a color from the background. Or I could simply pick a color that I want to use with the color picker. And I can increase the outline, the thickness, or also the darkness by changing the transparency here. So back to what I was doing with the panel. So this panel is going to be the login screen that pops up when the user presses the login button. So on this login screen, I probably want a text field for the user to enter their password. So that would be under UI as input field. And under input field, there is a placeholder text, which is the text that appears by default when you haven't typed anything in. And by default, it's set to enter text. I could change this to username, and then I could make a second one of these for the password. But I also want to increase the width and height, just like we have before. So maybe 200 by 50. And then I want to increase the font size both of the default text and of the text that the user is going to type. To make it look better, I want to use the same font size for both of these. If you set the font size to a low number like 1 or 2, it will actually default to fill the entire space. So sometimes that might be what you want, but you can also just specify the font size that you want. So maybe I'll use 30, and make sure you use the same font size for both. And I want my input box to be centered. And I'm going to raise it up a little bit. And then I'm going to Control D to duplicate, make a second one. And this second one, I'm going to set the placeholder text to say password. Now, if I hit play right now, input fields are automatically set up to just work. So I can type in my username and my password. Now, if you were making this an actual app, you'd obviously want the password to be hidden. This is just a prototype, so right now that doesn't really matter too much because the idea of the prototype is that it is to show an example of how the app might work. Unity is great for prototyping things like this, and if you were to develop an app in full development, there's a good chance you wouldn't end up using Unity for the finished product, but Unity is a great way to get started, to make a quick prototype, to figure out how things should function. So I have these two input fields, and I have my panel. And if I toggle my panel on and off, I can see that the input fields stay there on the screen. So what I want to do is take these two input fields and drag them onto the panel so they are a child. And now I can toggle this panel on and off. So the way buttons work in Unity, they have a very convenient on-click function that allows you to do things with objects that are in your scene. So I can just drag this panel object onto the empty game object on the on-click. Now I already made this on-click function by hitting the plus earlier. So if I were to go to my settings button, for example, I don't have that slot here, so I would need to hit plus first. But I'm not working with settings right now, I'm working with the login button. So I drag in my panel, and once I have a game object selected, then I can go to this no function dropdown, and I can choose what I want to do. And a lot of these components that are attached to the object have functions that I can access. The one that is most useful in prototyping is under game object, there is a set active function. And you can use this check mark to decide if I should be turning the game object on or off. So I've dragged the panel into this game object slot. I've chosen set active and I checked the box. Now if I hit play and I click the login button, it automatically opens up this settings panel. The login panel. So now on my login panel, I'm going to go ahead and first make a text at the top that says login, so it makes a little bit more sense. And I'll position this at the top. I might want it to be centered. So I'd center it in this text field, and then I would also set the X position to 0. And then make sure to take that text object and drag it onto the panel so it's a child of that panel. Now I also want my panel to have a way to go back. I could either do that with a back button at the bottom, or I could put an X in the corner and have a button for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a text object, and I'm just going to put the letter X and make this larger. And I'm actually going to reduce the width of this text object and position it in the top corner. I will also center this text so it's a little easier to work with. Make sure to drag this text object onto the panel as well, and I'm going to rename this to say close. So this button will close the login panel. Now this is just a text object. I didn't create a button, and the reason for that is because I want to show how easy it is to add a button component to any object, including a text object. So you could have a text object that functions as a button. And just as we did before, we can use the on-click area, And I will once again drag the panel object, and then from no function, game object, set active, and I'll leave this unchecked. So this will set the login panel to inactive. So now I can open the panel and I can close the panel. I probably want the panel turned off by default. And when you're prototyping an app, you want to make sure that the user can move through all of the screens. So chances are if they enter their username and password, they're going to want to continue. So I should have some kind of button at the bottom to log in or submit that info. So I'm going to make a button down at the bottom, game object, UI, button. Make sure to make it a child of the panel. And I'm going to set the position to 0, and I'll make it just a little bit taller. And change the text for that button to say login. Then just as I did with the login button, I would use the onClick function to load whatever is going to be my next screen or panel, or however I want to configure the next step after this. But basically, it would be the same process that we did to turn on this login panel. So that's a good amount of functionality. So the next thing that I want to do is adjust the visuals. So chances are you don't want to use the default font that comes with Unity. If you browse to on your computer, most computers have it. If it's a Windows computer, it's most likely under C/Windows/fonts. You'll find all of the fonts that are installed on your computer. And if you're using a Mac, then I'm actually not sure where those are stored on a Mac, but I'm sure you can Google that to find out where your fonts are stored. You can also download free fonts from websites online, and there are a lot of free ones that are available for you to use. So I'm just going to use one that's already installed on my computer. So I'm going to find a font that I feel like represents the type of app that I'm trying to make. For a mobile app, it's particularly important that you make sure that it is pretty easily readable at smaller sizes because phones are pretty small. So I'm just going to drag one of these fonts into my Unity folder. And then I could select my text for my title. And then I just drag that font to the font selection where it says Arial. So now I've updated the text for my app title. You don't necessarily need to use the same font for the title as you use for things like buttons and other on-screen text. So I might want a little bit simpler. Usually the fanciest font is used for the title, and then you use a simpler font for other things. Now you notice when I imported Gothic, it actually imported several different kinds of this Gothic font. So it has an italic version and a bold version and a regular version. So I'm going to select my button text. I'm going to select both of them at once. You can do this at the same time. And drag in one of those fonts that I've just downloaded. And do the same for the login panel. So I'm going to use this for the login text and also for the button at the bottom. So now I have my button font and my title font. I also generally like to change the buttons. I don't like to use Unity's default buttons because they are intentionally ugly so that people will change them and not just use the defaults. So if you select one of your buttons, there is a image where you can drag a button art that you want to use, and I've made a couple in Photoshop. Photoshop is really great for doing buttons, and there are some sort of easy built-in tools you can use to make a button that appears to sort of pop out of the screen. And this is just using the bevel option in Photoshop. I didn't even really mess around with the settings. This is just kind of the default look for bevel. And what's really convenient about doing this in Photoshop is you can switch to up or down, and this makes it easy to make a version of your button that is the up state and the down state, where the down state is what happens when you click on the button. So I've made an up state and a down state for my button. And so I would drag the up state into the image. And the image type here is set to simple. A lot of times buttons use sliced so that it effectively changes the size of the button without distorting any elements of the image. But I have not set a border on this image yet, so when I choose sliced, it says this image does not have a border. To change that, I would select my image. By the way, if you chose 3D when you started your project, it probably imported your art as textures, which the texture type would be default here. So you want to always make sure you change that to Sprite, 2D, and UI if you're working with UI elements. So if I want to give this a border so it can be sliced, I would go into the Sprite editor. And if you just drag these green handles, you can give it a border. And what you want to do is you want to make sure that the inside of the border is all a solid color, because this inside part is what's going to end up being stretched. Everything on the outside is going to attempt to maintain that texture resolution so that those things don't get distorted. When you hit close, it'll ask you to apply those changes. And after setting it to having that border, you might notice that the button now is very small. And so what we want to do is select that button image and adjust the pixels per unit. The default from Photoshop is, I think, 300 pixels per inch. So you want to make sure that you use the same pixels per unit here that you used in Photoshop. Now it's still a little bit different than the way that I want it to fit in this space. So what I would do at this point is I would go back to my button and I would increase the height and width to the size that I want it to be. It's maybe 75 by 250. And then I would just do the same for settings. So I would drag my button up into the image, and I don't need to do any of the changes again to button up because I've already changed that on the image itself. So I would just set my width and height to match the other button. Now, since I have a darker button image, I probably want to add an outline to my text or lighten the text color. For UI elements, you really want to make sure that you have good contrast between text and whatever is behind the text. So either doing that by having the text itself have a high contrast or having an outline that has a high contrast. So I could do a light colored text and a dark colored outline. that's a little bit too much contrast. So I'm just going to turn down the alpha for that outline. And I think 2 is actually a little too large also. It helps to have maximize on play and hit play so that you can see it at a larger size so that it more closely matches the size of your phone screen. If you hold your phone up to the size of your screen on your monitor so you can see if this is a good representation of how big this will be on your phone. So the next thing I want to do is I want to have my buttons, instead of having the tint that is the default, I want to change these to change the actual button image that's being displayed. So I'm going to select both buttons, and from this drop down, instead of color tint, I'm going to use sprite swap, and I'm going to drag my button down into the pressed sprite. I'm actually going to keep button up in my highlighted sprite. For mobile apps, the highlight is what happens when you hover over, but you don't really hover over things in a mobile app. Your finger is the mouse, and so when you tap something with your finger, that is a click, not a hover over. Now, if I was doing this for a web app, I would certainly want to have a different version of my sprite for the highlighted version to indicate being hovered over. A convenient thing to do for that is in Photoshop to add a outline or a outer glow. A glow is a nice way to indicate that you are hovering over a button. So now let's see what happens when I click on these. So now I can see my click state is changing the sprite that is being used. So the last thing to do once you are happy with how your buttons work and your text is working would be to actually build this onto your device. So if you go to the build settings window, here's where you would choose Android or iOS. If you are building for iOS, there are some extra steps involving Xcode, and so you'll want to find a tutorial about how to build using Xcode. But if you're using Android, all you would do is switch platform, plug your phone in, and then hit build and run, and it will automatically build it to your phone. You do need to make sure that your phone is in developer mode, and that's different for every Android phone, so that is something you would need to Google the steps for your specific phone. You would just Google your phone make and model and the words developer mode, and you should find instructions for how to turn your specific phone to developer mode. If we were building this for a web, this is where I would choose WebGL. And again, I would choose switch platform and build and run. When you build for WebGL, you will get a folder that includes an index.html file, and that is the actual web page itself, and the Unity app is then embedded in the web page. So that does it for this tutorial on how to use Unity's UI system to prototype apps for mobile and web. I hope you found this useful, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.